tonight about the vision of Redemptorist Associates. Where did that come from? What's the hope? And mostly, we don't want to just talk at you. We want you to have a conversation with you, because many of the people in this room are the leaders of either circles of associates, or they're part of provincial or vice provincial planning groups, or of the North American Secretariat for Partnership and Mission. So you have a particular role. So we're going to have a conversation about Redemptorist Associates and what that's all about and where that came from. So I want to start with this phrase that's on the screen ahead of you. One charismatic family in the heart of the church, dedicated to the mission of proclaiming good news to the most abandoned, particularly the materially poor. So pick that apart for a minute. Have a look at the phrase. I'll read it once more, and I want you to think of one word that jumps out at you.
Dedicated.
Dedicated, all right. Dedicated.
Materially poor.
Materially poor.
Heart.
Abandoned. Charismatic.
I'm wondering what that means.
Oh, okay. So it's a question. All right. Good. All right. Proclaiming. Good news. It's kind of a packed phrase, isn't it? It's not even really a sentence. It's a description of who we are and probably of who we hope to be. And I hope you noticed that I didn't say what. It's who. A Redemptorist Associate is a who. It's not about what you do. It's who you are and how you do it. So some of these words we're going to be picking apart in the next little bit. So
I'm going to say a little bit about kind of what the background to how we got to where we are right now. In other words, what the vision is about. And first of all, I want to say that from the beginning, Redemptorists have worked in cooperation with lay people. It's always been a part of our tradition and our way of living and doing things. We didn't have circles and titles and all that sort of thing. It was just the way that we did things. And it's still the way we do things. And we've kind of come to a point in our history and development where we thought it might be helpful to kind of formalize that and give it a little more structure and organization so that it might be able to work more effectively and be more widespread than it might otherwise have been. And I think that the beginnings of that kind of thinking are to be found in the Second Vatican Council. The whole new understanding, it's not new, it's an old understanding revived about baptism. That the baptized are one body. We are the body of Christ, and everybody in that body is participating in various ways in the mission and ministry of Jesus and the church. We had, through the centuries, become a very clerical church. And Vatican II began to kind of soften that and open that up with the reminder that every baptized person is a part of the body of Christ and shares in the mission of Jesus. Not just the ordained, and not just the religious, but everybody. And as the Redemptorists reflected on that, especially in general chapters and among the members of the general government and so on, this and practice, especially in Latin America, where lay people participated in the parish missions, or what we call parish missions. I mean, they went out into the abandoned areas of Brazil or wherever with teams of people, Redemptorists and lay people invading a place for a month or 6 weeks or whatever. so that experience, plus the theological reflection, I guess, from Second Vatican Council, gradually led to a more focused thinking about, we used the word collaboration at that time, the collaboration between lay people and Redemptorists. The famous Communicanda 4, Father Lasso, the Superior General at the time, he and his council were the ones who kind of first gave voice to this a little more specifically. And there was, I forget what year of the chapter, was it 91? When the category of lay missionaries of the Most Holy Redeemer was the general chapter agreed to that, and the category was created, but there was nobody in it yet. Okay, and so since then there's been a lot of reflection and discussion about how do we enflesh that. I've been involved in that in some ways. In 1999, so this was already 8 years after that chapter, the provincial of the Edmonton-Toronto province decided we really had to do something about that. And so I was on the provincial council at the time, and he approached me and asked if I would do something about collaboration with lay people. So that's kind of where it got started, and I didn't know what to do or if anybody was interested or anything like that. So the first thing we did was we had regional meetings across the province. That's really across the country in our case, and invited people that might be interested, and just kind of talked about sort of what we were thinking of, and to see if anyone was interested in being more formally associated with us. And it was actually quite an overwhelming response. I think the response of the confreres was underwhelming, but the response of the lay people was overwhelming. And so we decided we'd do something, and that's when we called on Anne. Were you a member of the youth mission team at that time?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So she was already working with us on the Redemptorist youth mission team in Canada. By baptism, every Christian is called and sent to serve the least of the brothers and sisters of Jesus. I think today I would say the sisters and brothers. Redemptorists have a long history of inviting the cooperation of lay people in carrying out the mission to follow Jesus by preaching the gospel to the most abandoned. That's based on the first of our constitutions. As Redemptorists have touched and changed the life of the church, they have also been touched and changed by the lives, the witness, and the collaboration of the people with and among whom they labor. So that we finally kind of came up with that statement after, 30 years of reflection. Okay, I was on the General Secretariat it was called the General Secretariat for collaboration, for lay collaboration at the time, and it was during that period when I was on the Secretariat that we decided that, a lot of people were complaining, especially in Europe, because collaboration had a whole other meaning after World War II. So Joe Tobin, the general, did not like this at all. But anyway, we proposed partnership in mission, and it kind of has taken off. So that's kind of what it gets called, in most places anyway. And it was that Secretariat that wrote that document called into communion information. Yeah, right. Thank you. Anne.
What? Called into communion for mission? Yeah, so it's a 2009 blue book. Yeah. So I think it helps not just to have words, but to have stories, right? Words, things like the things we're putting up here now, they're important and they capture something, but they don't capture the heart the way some of our own stories do. So I'm going to tell you a little tiny bit of mine, and I want you to think about your story a little bit. So all my life, I was drawn by the poor. I don't know why that is, and in some ways it doesn't really matter. But from my very earliest days, I wanted to be doing something with people who didn't have as much as I did. And I don't come from a very wealthy family, so we didn't have much, but there were people who had less. And when I became a teacher, I consciously chose to go to a rural community where people didn't have much at all. And to my great surprise, I thought I was going there to do something for them. But in fact, they did something for me. I think a friend of mine who works in Latin America talks about being ruined by the poor. And I think that's a great phrase. They ruined me. And I've never been the same, thanks be to God, because of those people. So as a result of their effect on my life, I decided to go and try to be better for them than I had been, to do more for them than I had been. Of course, while I was away, that's when I met the Redemptorists, really. I had met them before, and the first one I ever met was actually Father Mike Braille, who's now the Superior General. But in Toronto, I encountered them in a whole new way, and again, my life was changed. And one of the significant people in that was Father Lasso. I was working on Serve my first year with, we would welcome 12 young people to come in and spend 6 weeks living in community and doing Redemptorist outreach in the inner city Toronto. And so the kids weren't there yet. And there was a young Redemptorist student and myself making beds and getting the rooms ready, and the doorbell rang. And the provincial brought in this man who I did not know, and it was 1991, so he was on his way back from a general chapter in Brazil. And I didn't know who he was, so I brought him in, made him a cup of tea. We sat down in the library, and what he did was took down the globe, and he stopped the globe with his finger on Burkina Faso in Africa. And he told me the story of the Redemptorists he had visited recently in Burkina Faso. So he told me a story of people doing real things in really trying situations. And he left. But the next night he came back and he did the same thing. He spun the globe and stuck his finger on the globe, and it landed in Iraq. And he told me about the Redemptorists who were working and the people they were working with in Iraq. And the third night he came back. And the fourth. And the fifth night he said, "This time you'll take me to supper." So we took him, myself and the student, took him to a place called Villa Lucia over on Palmerston, just around the corner from the student house. Do you know, we walked in and the owners were Italian. Can you guess where they might be from? Scala. They were from Scala on the Amalfi Coast where the Redemptorists were founded. And so as soon as they knew we had the Superior General, we didn't know he was the Superior General after the 4 nights, but they knew, and they just welcomed us, and we thought there's something really special. At the end of the night, he turned to me and he said, "You are a Redemptorist too." And for the first time, there was this hope that something I had felt was put into words. And I never knew how that could be true, but I think I hoped that it could be. And it really has profoundly changed my life. Just that one invitation that he issued that night to see how I might someday belong to this family and maybe have a part in other people belonging as well. And how? We're still trying to figure that out. And we're working towards the day when we really realize what that family is and looks like and can do. So you're part of that. So I like this. This is from a prayer service that we're going to use later tonight. It captures something for me. Redemptorist life has never been possible without the support and encouragement of lay people, associates, benefactors, and friends. I think we'd also say families. Right? As we Redemptorists have touched and changed the life of the church, so we've been touched and changed by the people with whom and among whom we've been called to minister. In every place and at every stage of our history, we've looked for ways of joining with lay women and men in mission to more effectively proclaim the good news of plentiful redemption to those who most need to hear it. To me, that really captures something. And I'm going to ask you to think a little bit about your story. How is it that you came to be in this place at this time, tonight? How did you come to be here? Now, Lesha will say she came after a very trying trip from Phoenix. Poor Lesha was lost. And she's been found. Jose and Teresa will say, well, they came to be in this room because they were invited, and they came all the way from Portugal. I think Francis will say he came because he answered an invitation 40-some years ago, 50-some years ago, to be one of those professed Redemptorists around whom we gather. So for you, what brought you here tonight? And I'm going to ask you to turn to a neighbor and just share very briefly how that got started. Where's the route? How did you get to this place? And you're going to have 5 minutes. So take 2.5 each. And just turn to a neighbor. And if there's 3, that's fine too. It's really interesting to look, and lovely, because the joy is there. And that's what we really have to take hold of. That's the fire, right? The inspiration, or Barbara asked about the word charismatic, charismatic family. So a family of people on fire with the Holy Spirit, animated by the same Spirit as the founder, but not necessarily doing the same things as the founder. It's the Spirit. And charisms are gifts of the Holy Spirit that are given to the church for the good, or given to the church for the good of the church and the world. Right? So we often think of them as the property almost of a religious community. But religious communities hold charisms in a kind of trust. And there are others that share the charism, but not necessarily the specifics of the way of life. Right? So a charismatic family is people gathered around a particular charism or gift of the Spirit, still trying to find ways to exercise and live and give that Spirit to the church and to the world. So our story starts with St. Alphonsus. So I want to go back to him tonight to start. So for Alphonsus, his story of conversion, we've probably heard in 100 different ways. We know that really it's rooted in his family experience, his experience as a volunteer, we'd say today, at the Hospital for the Incurables with his dad and with his friends. We know that as a young lawyer, he was part of a community of young lawyers who tried to do good works in the streets of Naples. And that as a seminarian, a diocesan seminarian in Naples, he founded an outreach to the people of the streets, the poor people, the shopkeepers, the people who were the vendors in the streets of Naples. It was called the evening chapels. Now, what the evening chapels were a catechetical movement that no other opportunity to hear the gospel proclaimed in language they could easily understand were given that opportunity. And Alphonsus would take people who worked and lived among those people of the streets of Naples and train them as catechists. Interesting, many of them were not literate. And we know today some of the names. They've been passed down to us through Alphonsus' own writings, but also through the writings of some of the early biographers. And their stories are pretty inspiring. There was Pietro, now I never know how to say the names properly, Pietro Barbaresi. He was a barber, right? Luca Nardoni, who sold chestnuts in the streets of Naples. Bernardino the cowherd. None of these people are literate. And still Alphonsus sees something in them and engages them as catechists. Now, what they did was they founded a movement together that we think, all evidence would say, continued in the church and in the streets of Naples until Mussolini. So before there were Redemptorists, there was an outreach to the poor that had to have shaped Alphonsus' sense of what was possible and who it was possible to do it with and where the needs were. And really, I think that experience was part of Alphonsus' call to the most abandoned, so that when he went to Scala and met the shepherds and goatherds there who had never heard the good news proclaimed at all, because the churches had been shut down in the countryside, Alphonsus recognized those people. He had already been called to them, so that now the vision is taken a step further at Scala, and he founds a religious community, a charismatic family in the heart of the church, with the heart of the church, the poor, and dedicates not only his own life, but the life of that community to that outreach. And it has continued longer than the evening chapels have. So we come from a long line of faithfulness. You could probably say it started with the Holy Spirit, but certainly in its present manifestation started with Alphonsus Liguori, and started first with a catechetical outreach to the most poor of the streets, but was given an institutional frame and an ability to continue into the future by the founding of a religious community, an institute in the church. I always like to say we can also assume that there were some women in that group. It's most likely that there weren't just men, and that we don't know their names, and that's because history often doesn't tell those stories. But we can assume that they were, and that all of us in this room are in a way descendants not only of Alphonsus, but of those early partners in mission. It wasn't a Redemptorist mission, it was an Alphonsian mission. But important to remember that it's somehow part of our lineage too.
Once the Redemptorists were actually founded, there was this man, Clement Hofbauer. His name wasn't Clement yet. Well, no, by the time I'm talking about it was. His name was John, right? Yeah. He wanted to be a priest, and he was trying different places, didn't have money, all that kind of stuff. For a while he was a hermit. That's when he took the name Clement. But when and thanks to the generosity of a couple of women that he met in church in Vienna, he was able to begin theological studies. This was in the time of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Emperor Joseph had quite a thumb on the church. And Clement wasn't too thrilled with some of the theology that was being taught in Vienna, but he had somewhere along the line come to, at least I think this is the case, that he had actually read some of Alphonsus's writing, and so he was familiar with that Alphonsus is responsible for, I guess. He and his friend Thaddeus Hübel went on a pilgrimage to Rome. The story we've always been told, I'm not sure if it's really exactly correct, is that they decided they'd go to Mass in the first church whose bells they heard in the morning, and it happened to be the Redemptorist church. I have a suspicion that they were looking for the Redemptorists. I can't prove that. I'm not a historian, but I think that he was already, there was something stirring in him already, and he was looking for the Redemptorists. And when he found them and introduced himself, was it the next day or that very day, he and Thaddeus started their novitiate. And within a year, they had taken their vows as Redemptorists and been ordained priests, and been given the mission to bring the work of the Congregation of the Most Holy Redeemer across the Alps to the rest of Europe. And that's what they did. Because of the thumb of the emperor over the church, it was very difficult to do any kind of extraordinary church work. Even the preaching of missions was you know, so you could be a priest and work in a church and run a parish and all that, but there wasn't much openness to any other kind of approach, anything more charismatic, if I can use that. So Clement and Thaddeus kind of wandered around trying to find some place to get started. And the place where they were able to find to get started was in Warsaw, in Poland. There was a German-speaking community, a parish, St. Benno's, which was without a pastor. And Thaddeus and Clement kind of took over that parish. That community is really what I want to say. I mean, parish sounds too institutional. It was the people that they wanted to serve. And they discerned what the needs were and responded to them. We sometimes speak of the perpetual mission at St. Benno's, because every day they had preaching, sermons, times of prayer, and all as well as Eucharist, of course, and opportunity for all the other sacraments and what have you. They started a school for boys and a school for girls, and taught young women some skills so that they could find some work. You know, just they responded to the social needs in that German-speaking community in Warsaw. And it became a thriving thing. And in the process, a lot of men were attracted to the Redemptorist way of life. And so we actually ended up with, I think, probably more Redemptorists in Poland than there were in Italy at that time. It was going very well. The connections with the leadership in Rome were difficult. I mean, you could only do things by letter, and the mail was checked by government authorities and all that kind of thing. I mean, so there were all kinds of institutional difficulties. But the work, the mission of reaching out to the abandoned was definitely thriving. And then Napoleon came along. And he, dismissed. Well, I think they spent some time in jail first, and then the Redemptorists, and then they were sort of scattered to the winds. So there was a lot of cooperation with all the people in that community in St. Benno's, of course. Once they're scattered to the four winds, they're just struggling to survive. And so, some guys ended up being parish priests in little places, and they weren't together as a community anymore. Clement went to Vienna, and Thaddeus went with him. It was there that Thaddeus died, wasn't it? Was that in Vienna?
I thought he died more so.
Was it already in Poland?
Sweden,
Yeah.
Wasn't he?
Yeah. Anyway. But one of the things so when Clement got to Vienna, again, he was put in charge of a parish, Minoritenkirche. Sorry, I forget how to translate that into English. But anyway, and he began to, kind of gather a few people around him. The Congress of Vienna was going on, to settle all the stuff after Napoleon and what have you. And Clement he had connections with people who were in responsible positions in government and in professional life and so on. And he gathered them, and there were a lot of university students and young academics and all that were somehow attracted to him. And he worked with them and through them to really bring about a renewal of the church in Austria. And he did that in cooperation with all of those people. He could not have done it by himself, but he planted seeds, and the people that he dealt with kind of planted seeds, and it was a radical revolution in the Catholic Church, actually in the Austrian Empire, not just in Austria. It seems that there was some beginning of sort of formalizing that working together with between Redemptorists and lay people in the establishment of oblates. So there were a number of people, men and women, who became Redemptorist oblates. There's not, at least I have not found a lot of clarity about just how that worked and how it was structured and all, but there are enough references to it that we know there was some kind of more formal association between Redemptorists and lay people in the effort to carry out the mission of preaching the gospel to the most abandoned, especially the poor.
So the Redemptorists come to North America. And the points that are really important, I think, for us to remember after over 150 years of history are that lay people have always been involved in some key areas of Redemptorist outreach. And I like to think about it that way. It's mission. It's always about mission. And so one of the first ways that happened is in the promotion of devotion to Our Lady of Perpetual Help, for sure. But St. Gerard Majella would be another popular devotion. Many people won't even know that St. Gerard was a Redemptorist saint. But that the devotion to Gerard is amazing. People who have never heard of St. Alphonsus know St. Gerard and had this dedication to him. There was a time in my home province when Gerard was the most prominent name for a man, or Majella, one or the other. And so very, very popular. Many lay people have also collaborated with Redemptorists in Redemptorist youth and vocation ministry. And I think there have been countless benefactors who've supported Redemptorist mission with their interest, their financial aid, and their prayers. So this trend toward partnership in mission is a really key one that's always been part of our history. So a little bit there about North America. I want to talk about Canada and then the US. So many of us are Canadian here. So I think a few things to just kind of know about. Redemptorist and Associates have collaborated in almost every Canadian city where there was a Redemptorist house to form the first credit unions. Now, some of those were founded right after World War II. So I think what I want to say about that is that this is not about devotion to Our Lady of Perpetual Help. This is not just about prayer or liturgy or good preaching. This is about living the gospel and connecting the good news to the real and practical needs of people. So when soldiers were coming back from World War II and starting families, but had no money, what did they do? Redemptorists and some of their lay partners taught them how to start credit unions and issue microloans to help people buy their first houses, to buy their first cars, to finance themselves coming back from war. Now, I think that's really inspiring because it's that practical connection between the gospel and people's lives. So this is, yeah, David.
I want, when you're finished on the credit union stuff, I just want to share a couple of...
I think you should do it now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a couple of examples of... The first one isn't actually a credit union, but when there was a great migration of German people to the city of Toronto, and Father Dan Eamon was the pastor of the German parish, as we actually still call it, even though it's not German anymore. And these were people who were, they'd come from war and they had nothing and all that. And one of the things that, they would always gather for everybody's funerals and stuff, but it was here in Canada, or there in Canada, we're not in Canada right now, funerals were becoming a little more of an expense. And to enable people to pay for funerals, you could sign up. He called it the Funeral Society. And everyone who wanted to belong to that contributed 25 cents every Sunday to the Funeral Society. And we had hundreds of people in that parish, and everybody, of course, participated. And so by the time, once they had kind of built up a bit of a what would you call it? A body of cash, I guess we could say. Then when somebody who died who belonged to the society, the funeral was paid for by the society. And people kept contributing and kept dying. And so, it was a practical need. And Father Dan Eamon came up with a way to help meet that, where everybody was involved and sharing in the process. The other example I want to give is Edmonton. I grew up in the Redemptorist parish in Edmonton, Alberta, St. Alphonsus Parish, where Father Mangan, a Redemptorist who was stationed at St. Alphonsus, established a credit union. The credit office that was in the basement of the church. It was open Friday nights, and people came to, withdraw or put in or whatever they're doing, get their loans and all that sort of thing. And it eventually was certified by the province of Alberta as a credit union. The first certified credit union in the province of Alberta was the Mangan Credit Union at St. Alphonsus Parish. And when I was very small, the secretary-treasurer of that was a man by the name of Charlie Edwards. I know a lot of his family and so on. And when he died, my dad took over as the secretary-treasurer. And started they were always at the church basement on Friday nights, but he also set up a little office in the basement of our home so that people who weren't able to go on Friday nights could come some other time. And he died. My dad was quite young when he died. He died at 57. And the church was absolutely packed at his funeral with people that we didn't even know. And they were people from the credit union whom he had helped to get loans or get started in their small businesses and things like that. And all of that came out of the Redemptorist charism.
And so this is it. Like, we tend to think that Redemptorist associates started now. But these are Redemptorist associates, right? This is partnership in mission way back. In my home, I spent most of my life in the Diocese of Grand Falls, central Newfoundland, very rural, quite poor. Catholics are not a huge part of that population. So after Vatican II, Redemptorist parishes in Canada were among the first to kind of advocate for lay Eucharistic ministers and lay readers, and to hire lay pastoral associates. So the Redemptorist parish in Whitburn was the very first to petition Bishop O'Neill after Vatican II. It was 1969. And they asked to have lay Eucharistic ministers. And the bishop was fuming. Now, he was a big bear of a man, and his hands were like paws. And so the letter came in, and it is said that he turned it over and wouldn't look at it. And it was on his desk for weeks. And a reporter came in from the local news to talk about what was happening with the implementation of the reforms of Vatican II. And so the reporter said, "What do you think of the emerging laity?" And O'Neill slammed his hand down on that letter and said, "Let them emerge." But years later, when I became involved first in partnership and mission in the Edmonton-Toronto province, the provincial was Ray Corriveau. And when I wanted anything, he would look at me and he'd put his hand down, and he wasn't nearly as big as O'Neill, and he'd go, "Let her emerge," which was really good. So the lay members of mission teams began to be engaged in Canada, and there were couples who were preaching on Redemptorist mission teams, and single people, and music came to be a huge feature of those missions. And lay partners were also involved in the promotion of devotion to Blessed Basil Velichkovsky in the Yorkton province. So in all kinds of areas, there was this drive to engage lay people. It was as if the Redemptorists of Canada, and I think this would be true worldwide, took to the reforms of Vatican II like ducks to water. And it was a real moment of beginning to say, how does this charism meet what's happening in the church today? So now, this is not my story, so somebody from the US might want to talk about this. But I think a huge thing that's been a feature of Redemptorist ministry in the US is the Apostle of the Pen. Things like Liguori Publications, but I think there have been other publications as well. Collaboration with vowed women religious, and I think about St. John Neumann in particular, and even founding some communities of women religious. That was a significant thing. As the parochial school system spread throughout the United States, Redemptorists and religious women had a particular partnership that allowed that to flourish in a very enlivening way. And lay partners have also been involved in the promotion to St. John Neumann and also to Blessed Francis Xavier Silas. But is there anybody from the U.S. who'd speak to that more with more knowledge than I would have? Yeah, go for it, Anthony.
But I would have to, because I was stationed for 4 years at the shrine of St. John Neumann. And I think that, oh my goodness, where would I even begin? But you know, he is the founder of the Catholic school system, St. John Neumann. It's important to know that. And I think if we really needed today 2 patron saints, and I'm going to count Blessed Francis as a saint here, these are 2 men who will definitely enrich what we're doing here and move us in the right direction. St. John Neumann, I'm so tired. Thank you for calling me up, because I was getting sleepy-eyed back there. It's been a long, long day, not because we were together, but it's just a lot of travel and everything. But I've given so many tours and talks on St. John Neumann, and as I said, I didn't expect to stand up here in front of you, but he did. He founded the Sisters of St. Francis of Glenriddle, and he was huge in promoting, bringing sisters over and from Europe and getting them involved in the Catholic school systems. By the end of his 8 years, if you think about this, the Diocese of Philadelphia was half of Pennsylvania, all of Delaware, and 3/4 of the state of New Jersey. Can you imagine that? And he was bishop of all of that area. In an age when we're tearing down churches, in those 8 years, he saw the construction of over 80 churches and a school, a Catholic school for almost every one of them. That's just one tiny little part of the amount of work that he did. But as far as promoting sisters and reaching out to, also, you know, there's a little bit of history here with, you're talking about the practicalities of finance and so forth. The history here is a little sketchy, but he's accredited with founding Beneficial Bank to again help the immigrants, and that was his chief thrust. That's why he came to this country, to help the immigrants who were coming from Europe at the time, mainly German, but Irish, French, Polish. He spoke 8 languages. But he founded Beneficial Bank, it is said, but then there are those who contradict that. There's something he founded there to help those coming who were financially challenged and didn't even know how to begin to deal with their finances here. So I would just say he's a great patron saint for us, all right? And forgive me for blabbering when I'm so tired.
I think you can see that this is more than the parish many of us know today. This is a social outreach, a catechetical outreach, a very practical outreach that touches the lives of real people where they are. And that's what we're called to do together today, to reach out in the name of Jesus, to touch people's lives where they most need that, and in practical ways proclaim the good news by our presence and then by our words. So we're becoming aware that all through our history and now there are a variety of forms of partnership in mission. I think we've just seen that in this really sketchy overview of history. and that we're learning that there's such an entity as a Redemptorist family. Now, we'd say that's a charismatic family, Barb. Gathered around and in the spirit of St. Alphonsus and the Redemptorists. It's not just an Alphonsian thing. It's the way it's been lived out by Redemptorists over the history. And the mission of proclaiming good news to the most abandoned, those who most need it. And what we look forward to with hope is the new forms of collaboration between Redemptorists and laity, which are emerging and which will emerge as we respond more fully to the real needs. Yeah, I know. See, I'm using that word on purpose. I like that word. And this is a quote from Father Lasso that I just love. We rejoice that the Holy Spirit today is urging lay people to a greater collaboration in the evangelizing of the poor. And we believe that this constitutes a precious sign of the times for the ecclesial and the Redemptorist community. And that's a quote from Communicanda 4, which is really the seed of where we are. So we're going to do a little bit to clue this up, but I want you to turn to one another and think about what you've just heard in the last half hour or so that you find inspiring, that maybe puts a new perspective on things for you, that you never knew before, or maybe something that was affirmed for you. So take a moment and turn to either the person you were talking to before or somebody else. And what is either new or affirmed for you over the last little while? What struck you? So what about what you've heard tonight was either inspiring or affirming or struck you in some way? And you can feel free to say it. If you say it, I'll repeat it so anybody who's listening at home in our viewing audience will be able to hear it. What did you hear? Francis, you're just urging there.
Well, I'll come.
Okay, come up.
I wish we had better history of the participation of lay folk, because none of the things that we're talking about could have happened without the cooperation and partnership. And the Redemptorists were known in the East Coast for sure of extraordinary outreach to families of children who didn't have parents. They built incredible orphanages. And one of the greatest tragedies in New York City, if you know of our history there, was the sinking of the Slocum. You've seen there's a PBS special on that. Show. So other than 9/11, I think the Slocum was the largest tragedy in New York, and the other one is the Shirt Race Factory fire. And I forget how many hundreds of people drowned in the East River with that. And the Redemptorists responded by building this massive orphanage. And you know that had to be with the participation of the laity, huh? And so the credit unions we also had. But you know, almost every Redemptorist parish in all our great parishes of Baltimore, New York, Philadelphia, Rochester, Buffalo, all those parishes all had secretarial schools. Every one of them for immigrant women who had no other real chance for a career, and they all had a year or 2 year secretarial schools.
See, it calls us to remember differently, doesn't it? It really asks us to pull something together and see there's a consistency to this. This is what mission does for us. Who else? What else inspired you? Don't all talk at once. Yeah, Elizabeth.
Hearing the way the Redemptorist charism was expressed in different communities to meet the needs of people in different situations.
So hearing the way that the Redemptorist charism was expressed with the same thrust, but in different ways, depending on the particular needs of people and in particular times. Yeah, it's not a static thing. It's an alive thing, right? Yeah, yeah.
I remember a story of the late Brother Patrick Considine. When he was in Chicago, he met a group of Filipinos who just moved to the city, and he knows that Filipinos have a big devotion to our Mother Perpetual Help. Then when you're all talking about the apostolate of the pen, I remember him telling me, how he would go and write handwritten letters to people, Filipinos that he met, and then he started doing that, and then all of a sudden the Filipinos had received his letter, would go and tell somebody that they received this letter, and then they started organizing themselves, the whole lay people started organizing themselves. Oh, let's make plans for the Mother Perpetual Help novena. And that has become a big event in Chicago at the time when Brother Patrick was around. And so basically the whole lay people, the whole Filipinos just came together and made something small really big.
But that particular Redemptorist, Brother Patrick did. And I imagine that still continues, doesn't it? Yeah, right? Barbara.
Well, you've got me thinking, as you always do that. But I was reflecting back to Our Lady of the Assumption Parish and what you said about the Redemptorists taking to Vatican II reforms like a duck to water in terms of involving lay people. And we had for a number of years a huge catechetical program. And because there was no Catholic school in the area, so most of the families in the parish came to this catechetical group. And it was a bit unorthodox because we would have, and it evolved over a number of years to this, but we felt that it was important to involve parents in sacramental preparation and in faith formation. And this is back in the 70s, 80s. So we developed this format where during what would normally be the homily time, the children would go to catechism classes and the parents would have classes or groups which were led by lay people.
Mm-hmm.
But that meant a priest had to be available every Sunday to be there for a couple of hours and be open to that,
So, really in a time when there would be no adult faith formation done, we did take that to be the norm now. That wasn't the norm then. And so there's some effort being made to do adult faith formation and not just children's faith formation. Yeah.
But I think what was important was there was an openness there to allow this to happen.
Mm-hmm. Kind of encourage it.
Which, when, I've been in Redemptorist parishes virtually, all my life in Canada. And I don't think I understand when other people say how fortunate you are. What's going on?
Yeah, because we tend to say this is the way it always is. And that's not so. But it's hard to say that from our perspective. So you need a night like tonight where we tell some of these stories. And we're only telling the pieces we know and very sketchily, right? So yeah. So what you're seeing is a perspective that we don't always see because we're in the middle of it. It's like a fish doesn't see water. It's just what the fish swims in, right?
Francis Gargania and I had a nice conversation at supper time with our visitors from Portugal. And what they gave a lovely description of what the Redemptorist lay missionaries are doing in Porto which is very much like what St. Clement did in Vienna. Would you mind telling us a bit about that?
Sorry for my English, I will make some mistakes, but you'll forgive me for sure. You are Redemptorist. So I was thinking about saying something to answer to you, so I will mix both requests. I love something that Anne said about the Redemptorists being among the first ones after the Second Vatican, but maybe since ever the Redemptorists are among the first ones who try, and that's how I feel as a Redemptorist lay missionary, is that we should be among the first ones. And so to be among the first ones is to try to be like the first ones in the church. So to be among the first ones is to live among the first ones who built the church. And there was no priests or lay people. There was Christians. Well, not Christians at all. There were people who wanted to follow Jesus. And they started to build circles of people, small communities, and through small communities to grow and grow and grow until they call themselves as a church. And that's what we try to do in Porto in the last 15 years, to build small circles of people, lay people, gathering to receive formation, adult formation. And we had empty churches like everywhere in Europe. I don't know if here it's the same in North America, but in Europe the churches are empty, or they are discos or bars or, well, theaters, a lot of things. But in Porto, it's the same, so a lot of empty churches, and the Redemptorists were not very different. But thanks to the work of 2 confreres and some lay people, we started to offer faith formation to adult people, and we started to build circles. So 15 persons gathering every week to receive formation in the first place. Then people started to feel the need to share their faith, to share their questions. And year after year, the commitment was growing, and people started to feel a call for the mission, a call to share mission with the confreres, to go to tell to others what they were feeling. And, well, year after year, these circles are made today by mainly people who are out of the church, or we went out of the church because they were disappointed for some reason. They didn't believe the church had some good news for them, and they came back. And because those ones who came back, others came also, and some of them they didn't belong to the church in any point of their life, and they came for the first time to be in the church. I like Jesus. I don't like this thing that you call church, but I like Jesus, so I will give you an opportunity. And they stay, and they stay, and they stay. And today we have, well, Anne was there last week, so she also can, because I'm talking from my context, but Anne saw some of these people. And we have a vibrant community in Porto, in the north of Portugal. And this community is formed by circles, by small circles of people. And this is the origin of the church. And this is how Alfonso started to feel a call for mission, as Anne explained, by the evening chapels. This is how St. Clemens worked in Vienna. This is how the Redemptorists are called to work, I believe. Redemptorists are called to live in communities. They have a very strong chapter in their constitutions about community life. And we are called to build communities, to build circles of people who share the faith. And this, for me and for Teresa, I know it's the same, it's the most attractive thing about the Redemptorists, to be among the first ones, so to be like the first ones, and to take the risks of being the first ones also, to build communities, and to be a family. And the last thing I would like to share is when Anne said that Lasso told her, you are also a Redemptorist. Like when you, religious Redemptorists, say, well, I'm Redemptorist because I also am a Redemptorist. So I don't like when we distinguish ourselves as Redemptorists and lay. I also am a Redemptorist, and I really feel like that. And of course it's different. Of course I'm not saying it's the same thing, and thanks God it's not. But I do feel as a Redemptorist, as lay missionary, of course. And it's really not a question of what we are doing, but of who we are. And this is the very special thing about our family. It's everyone has a place here. And thanks for welcoming us here in this place also.
So I think Jose said it really well, and we're going to just clue up this part of the evening by talking about that sense of home that he's been actually saying without really saying home. I think it's an important thing for us. Who are Redemptorist associates? Well, you. We've got a community here of professed and associates and lay missionaries of the Most Holy Redeemer. We're some kind of expression of this Redemptorist family that we're living our way into understanding. So we say this about ourselves. When we pray, and we're going to pray tonight with Chris, who's being enrolled as a Redemptorist associate. Many of you have celebrated this. What we pray when we enroll Redemptorist associates here in North America is this. We say, drawn by the way of life and the spirituality of Redemptorists, Redemptorist associates gather regularly for prayer, gospel reflection, faith sharing, and community. That's not why we exist, though. That's what we do. We exist to reach out in mission to the most wounded, the most abandoned, right? To touch them and somehow try by our presence, by our words, by our way, to make their lives a little better, to leave them a bit better than we found them. So we'd say that most of us are already doing what needs to be done. What happens when you're a Redemptorist associate is you find a sense of home. You're not going to do more. You're already doing what the Redemptorist family does. You're most likely already involved in outreach to the poor. You're already involved in some catechetical ministry. You're already a person who tries to touch the most abandoned. So what this does is you say, in this spirituality of the Redemptorist family, I feel like I'm at home. I feel like I belong somehow.
Amen. That's the kind of terminology that we developed in the Edmonton Toronto province as we were talking about, well, sometimes it was more about what's the difference between lay missionaries and Redemptorist associates and all that kind of thing. A lot of people thought we were supposed to be, developing new ministries or something, but that's not what Redemptorist associates are about. They're people who are already engaged in the life and ministry of the church, and what being a Redemptorist associate offers to them is a spirituality, a family, a community that supports and nourishes and encourages that ministry mission that you're already doing. So people always say, oh, yeah, I'm already doing enough. And they are. And becoming a Redemptorist associate is not asking you to do more. It's asking you to do what you're already doing with a new depth and understanding and spirit. Okay?
Yeah. And so normally what we do is we offer, what the Redemptorist family can do is help those who feel drawn to this spirit by offering some formation, a kind of an initial formation that helps you to say, do I fit here? Is this really where I belong? And then in North America, we enroll Redemptorist associates. And then we continue to gather for faith sharing and support.
So who should become a Redemptorist associate? Those who feel a need for a spiritual home, a spirituality that gives your life a foundation or coherence. Those who seek a community with whom you can share life, prayer, and mission.
So this should sound like what happens in Portugal too, right? It should be the same. And that wasn't planned, interestingly enough, which says there's something to this to me, right? Those who are drawn toward the Redemptorist community and their way of life and want to share that somehow. But as you said, there's different ways to express that. Those who feel compelled, like those who've been ruined by the poor, to reach out to those that nobody else is reaching out to, right? Those who want to be good news for the poor, the powerless, or the wounded of our world.
So if these questions speak to a person's heart, they might be interested in becoming a Redemptorist associate. And not everybody is going to be responding to everything. Okay.
Questions, comments, tomatoes? Yes, Francis.
Well, is it possible to hear from one or more of the peoples here, the Desert Associates, why you became part of the circle and what it's meant to you, what difference it's made?
Yeah, sure. And Jenny, come on.
I love being in front of a microphone, I have to tell you that. That's why I'm up here, really. No, about 20 years ago, I met Father Dick Mevison here. And I only live down the road, but my parish is about 20 minutes away from here. And I started coming to Mass here. And I felt very much, as you're talking, at home. And one of the things that projected me to continue was that I had a friend who died out here, and she was from Grosse Pointe, Michigan. And at that time, I hadn't seen Father or talked to him in a long time. And I tracked him down through this community here, and I asked him if he would do the memorial service for my friend who had died, because she wanted to go back to Michigan to be interred with her mother, because she had been a nun for 30 years, and so she was single, so she was allowed to do that. And you know, one of the things he did was he was so open about it, and he said, of course I'll do it for you. And we hadn't seen each other in a very, very long time. And so that gave me the first heart of the Redemptorists, that, you know, they were available, that he was available to do that for me. I mean, it wasn't anything other, and for my friend Lucille. Anyway, I've been going backwards and forwards here for 20 years, and I had to go to England because I'd had cancer, and I had no health insurance here because I had been working up in Canada. And I came back here, and I had done a master's at Gonzaga, and I had a lot of things I really wanted to do, and I had put off doing them for a very long time, and that is retreat work, and cancer had been a really bad interruption to what I was doing, I can tell you. And so I came here, and I'm not going to tell you who I talked to first of all, because I was really put off by it when I said, oh, I'd like to do something here, and I talked to one of the priests. I'm not going to tell you who it was, and I got really put off. And then I met Lee, actually, and Lee was the one, I went to one of the prayer groups, and she was one of the people who encouraged me to use the gifts that I have. And I never really thought of them as gifts. I thought of them as learning, because that is what I'd done. And I started with Lee in the group. And when I had been an oblate, a Benedictine oblate also, and then the Benedictines left here, and things had happened in Pecos, New Mexico, and I really was not kept up. And I'd always wanted to be a part of something bigger and greater than myself, of where God is the foundation. I have to thank Father Paul for allowing me to do also what I've been doing here. to use the gifts that I have. And that is the thing that brought me into be an associate, is using the gifts and being allowed to use the gifts that I have to impart the knowledge of God's love through the Redemptorists to other people. And that basically is why I'm an associate. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Francis, my wife Chris back there, and I think the question I'm supposed to be kind of addressing right now is what kind of drew us here. And there's about 30 of us. Is that right, Father Paul? Approximately 30 of us and Father Ed in our group here, our circle at this particular location. And this place is a Redemptorist Renewal Center. Okay, this is a place where people come to renew. You know, what are they really looking for? I'd say, generally speaking, to feel something from the heart, learn more about who we are, our religion, our God, and it's a very, very special place. And recently here, well, I say recently, maybe 5 years ago, my wife and I, we came here, and it took no time at all to realize that this location was so very special. Not only where it was and what is here, what you see, but the people that were here, and especially our leaders, our priests, Father Paul amongst, and Father Greg May here, and we had others, Father Weiss, and we also had Father Charlie, and it was so wonderful. It was so very wonderful. It became something that drew us here every Sunday or Saturday evening, be it that's the time you went, or even during the week. We found out that we just absolutely loved it here. And we started to feel part of a family. You started to see people over and over, and you'd smile and you'd talk a bit and find out how you were doing. And so essentially, I think I can kind of speak for most of the people in the group. We were offered this opportunity, and we wanted to learn more. We had a thirst for what this was about, where this could take us. And so that's what caused us to join this group and to stay with the group and to find that happiness and the joy each time that we met together as this family and we shared. And so we find out about the Redemptorists and how they've spread out everywhere. We've learned the history, and it's a beautiful history, an absolutely beautiful history. And what I found out, I'm from Pittsburgh, as is my wife, and that about a year and a half ago, I was there, and I would take my mother to St. Sebastian's Church in Pittsburgh, and she always loved to go to the early Mass. And so I like to go to the early Mass, as does my wife. We're sacristans, and we work at the 7:30 Mass 2 weekends out of the month. And to my dismay, I found out that what's happening back there, the churches are coming together in a group, and the churches are having Masses that used to be an early Mass here is no longer an early Mass there. If you want that early Mass, you've got to go to another church. And I said, well, let me see what I can find out. And I went on the website and found out that they brought 5 churches together. St. Sebastian's, St. Alexis, a church that my wife's father had helped design as an architect. There was a church called St. Alphonsus. And St. Alphonsus, I found out, is only a few miles away from my mother's, maybe 5. And I said, well, that's interesting. Here I'm becoming this lay associate, and we're learning about St. Alphonsus Liguori. And here's this church. And I said, I'm going to go out and have to visit that church. And so, I got in the car. My mother could no longer go to Mass. She's 93 years old. And I'll be honest with you, you go to some of the churches, and it's a punishment to sit in the pews. That's where you do your suffering, for your sins. But I couldn't take her, so I went out, and it was Christmas time, and it was so very cold. And I went there and found this nondescript church up on a hill along a road they called Church Way. And that would be the way to the church. And so I got up there, and I go into this church, and it's so plain inside. It's an old church, so very plain. So many of the churches we go to, so adorned with beauty. This church was not. This was a very practical church. And I was just mystified by this. And so I went through the Mass. It was a very good sermon. And I went and talked to the priest afterwards. And I thought, well, maybe he knows something about the Redemptorists. And he said, no, not really. He says, I'm a diocesan priest, about who I was and what we have here. And he smiled and said, well, that's very nice. And he went about his business because he had another mass. And so I went outside and started to look around, and I saw that there was an academy, a Catholic school. It was St. Silos Academy was there. That got my attention right away. I walked around the campus, wind blowing, very, very cold. There were statues, St. Alphonsus, Blessed Saint or Blessed Silos. Statues outside. There was a cemetery. I walked through the cemetery, and I found graves that went all the way back to the 1700s. If you can imagine, people buried there that were born in the 1700s. This was a magical place. And as we had learned a little earlier about the Redemptorists starting credit unions and doing things for the immigrants, the people really in need, I started to think to myself, well, the roads that I took to get out here, Bonnie Way, Limerick, other places or roads of that sort. And what did it kind of tell me? It said, well, this church was put here to serve the immigrants. This is what it's all about, is to serve those people in need. And I was just absolutely astounded to see this. And as we look around now, we find out, as people migrated from different parts of the world, they would set up communities where they felt at home. What did they do? They named their streets. They named their towns out of places where they came. Well, this is what it was all about. This is what St. Alphonsus was all about. He came here and, along with the other Redemptorists, and set up these locations. And even St. John Newman was the pastor of St. Philomena's, just maybe 15 miles away from this church. And St. John Newman actually conducted Mass at times at this church. So it all is tied together. And we find out this is not only a very spiritual thing, but it's a practical way of life that we have here. We just look out there and search for the answers and see really what it's about. And this is what we're seeing tonight. We're looking at the history of the lay associates, and we can make it practical. It's our choice to go out there and search and get with the people, learn more and more, and get that feeling inside that draws us forward in this mission that we're on. Thank you.
Just one little thing. We shouldn't call them lay associates, but Redemptorist associates.